Earlier this week, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates again. That'll be unpleasant news to households across the country. It's also a red flag because Canadians collectively carry the most debt of any G7 country. That was not always the case, and actually household debt has been declining elsewhere. Let's get a sense of what's happening and why it's everyone's business from, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. And in Ottawa, Mike Moffatt, Senior Director at the Smart Prosperity think tank and Assistant Professor at Western University's Ivey Business School. Hi to you both.
Hello, Nam.
Hello.
So lots of news about the interest rates. We're going to get to that in a minute. But Jim, can you give us a definition of what household debt is?
Well, household debt, you just add up, Nam, all the money you owe to other people and see how big it is at the bottom line. Obviously, the biggest part of that in Canada is mortgage debt that people have taken on to help buy a house, $2.1 trillion of mortgage debt. Then on top of that, you can add your credit card bills, your new car loans, your student loans, maybe even a little bit you owe to the loan shark down the street. Who knows? Total household debt in Canada, $2.8 trillion, trillion with a T.
Wow, that is a big number. I'm getting stressed just hearing you list everything off because I'm like, check, check, check. But before we talk about how it's impacting Canadians, I thought we could talk about how we compare to other countries when it comes to household debt. Here's a chart showing debt as share of GDP, comparing 2010 to 2021 in the G7 countries. The blue bars are from 2010 and the red bars are from 2021. Right off the bat, numbers for Italy have stayed almost the same and are the lowest in the G7. 2010, it was 43, and in 2021, a slight increase to 44. Next, the UK and US are almost the same in 2010 at 94, UK, and US at 92. The numbers for debt drops for both countries in 2021, for the US to 78 and the UK to 86%. However, when we looked at Canada, it was nearly the same with the UK at 95 in 2010, but in 2021 rose to an astounding 107%. Mike, in 2010, as we noticed there, household debt in Canada was 95% of the GDP, and in 2021 it was 107%. Does this concern you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason is that housing explains everything. That you look at which countries have high levels of debt. They're countries like Canada, like the UK. Australia is not on here, but they've got one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. So absolutely, that why Canadians are going into so much debt is because home prices are so high, and it's kind of forcing them to do so. And in fact, they tend to be the lucky ones because they're actually allowed to do it. We have a lot of people who can't get any housing at all because they're just not eligible to get that debt.
But also renters are in a precarious situation because their rents are going up, and significantly, I'm assuming in those households, housing is the biggest chunk of money. How important is it to differentiate that it is housing that's taking up so much household debt instead of people just maybe going to the mall and spending frivolously? Mike?
Well, I think it is important because you do get an asset out of it at the end of the day, right? This is not something you're going out and ordering some pizzas and putting that in your credit card. That this is an asset, but it causes households to basically have all of their eggs in one basket. That so much of their financial portfolio is wrapped up in a single asset. So here in Ottawa, for instance, most of my household net worth is tied up into my home. And that can be a very dangerous thing. And we saw this here in Ottawa 20 years ago, that when Nortel imploded, not only did the local economy not do that well, but we had a house price crash. So it's causing Canadians to have very undiversified financial portfolios. And again, those are the lucky ones who aren't stuck renting or worse.
Jim, both you and Mike have mentioned that housing is a huge chunk of household debt. Is there another reason why Canadians have so much debt?
Well, we've been measuring debt, Nam, relative to our GDP as a country, or it's often also measured relative to the disposable income of Canadian households. That's an even scarier number if we want to get grim about it. About 180% of disposable income. In other words, Canadians owe about 1.8 times more than their annual after-tax income, which is also very high compared to other countries. Remember, those are ratios. So here's some basic math. A ratio has a numerator and a denominator. The numerator on top of the fraction is the debt, but the denominator is also relevant here. That is to say, how is our GDP growing? Or for households, they don't really care about GDP. It's their actual own income that is growing. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the stagnation of real incomes for Canadians over the last generation. We have not seen very strong wage growth relative to inflation. In fact, during the current inflation, we've seen wage growth going backwards relative to inflation. So that, again, escalates the relative size of that debt compared to our incomes and our ability to service that debt.
Mike, when this much money is wrapped up in household debt, how does that impact the broader economy?
Well, it certainly adds risk, particularly when interest rates change. So again, I'm going to use personal examples from my own life that a lot of my financial net worth is wrapped up in the home that I'm currently in. And my mortgage renews in August, and it's going to be a much higher rate than it was 5 years ago. So what that means for folks like me, as that mortgage renews, that's a lot of money coming out of our pockets that's going somewhere else. Now, for folks like me, that's just kind of a frustrating thing, something I can live with, maybe fewer vacations. But for those who are precariously housed or, 1 or 2 paychecks away from insolvency, that causes real financial hardships for them.
Jim, I want to pose that same question to you.
Yeah, we have seen this huge run-up in interest rates led by the Bank of Canada starting a little over a year ago. They are jacking up rates because that's how they think is the best way to get inflation out of the system. But for households that do have debt, this is going to be punishing. And we are seeing it already in the total debt service charges that households are paying. They have grown by about $40 billion at an annual rate a year since the Bank of Canada started raising rates. So that means $40 billion a year, close to 2% of our GDP, that households are no longer spending on food, clothing, and shelter. It's actually money that flows straight to the banks. And, right now the banks obviously are appreciating that, although they have to weigh that against the risk of bankruptcies and loan losses, which could be around the corner. But from the economy's perspective, this is just a drain on the purchasing power of Canadians, and it's one of the reasons that our economy is slowing down and is going to slow down some more in the months ahead.
Jim, I have to follow up on a few things that you said. You said that the Bank of Canada is increasing the interest rate because that's, quote, how they think, and it's punishing households. Can you expand on that? How is it punishing households?
Well,
is there another way to take? Is there another avenue to take to
control inflation? Sure. I think we do need a more diversified strategy for controlling inflation. The textbook theory, really written back after the inflationary episodes of the 1970s and 1980s. The textbook theory is the central bank should target a certain number for the inflation rate. In Canada, they've picked 2% as the magic number, and then use the interest rate, the big hammer, if you like, in their toolbox, to try and get inflation to that level. And the underlying assumption is that inflation is always caused by too much spending power in the economy. Therefore, higher interest rates, by draining off that spending power, will solve the problem. In the wake of the pandemic, though, those textbook models really had to be reconsidered, if not thrown right out. This inflation that we're experiencing clearly resulted from supply shocks and global disruptions, consumer desperation after months of lockdowns, pent-up demand, and an energy price shock. None of those things had to do with Canadians having too much spending power. So I think that the bank's approach to controlling inflation has been too narrow. Think of it this way, Nam. If you have a toolbox and the only thing in that toolbox is a great big hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And that's kind of what the Bank of Canada is doing here. Whatever the causes of inflation, we're going to hammer it with this interest rate hammer. And I don't think it's the most effective way to control inflation, this type of inflation. And it is certainly causing a lot of distress for households who are going to have to find several $100s or even over $1,000 a month to pay for those extra interest charges.
Mike, I want to follow up with you because I see you and I think, keep the same, we wake up very early. I see you on Twitter talking about this because sometimes I think when it comes to this stuff, it's just dollars and cents, but on the ground, it's impacting Canadians' lives in a real way. We know that more Canadians are using food banks than ever. There's a cost of living crisis. When the interest rates go up, why is it important for us to think about how it's impacting Canadians directly instead of kind of having this bigger picture about getting things in control?
Yeah, well, it's certainly we can't forget the human side of it, because Jim is absolutely right. Like, that's the sort of textbook definition of how you drive down inflation is that you damp down consumer spending, and you do so by taking money out of the pockets of consumers because they're paying that in higher interest rates. But it's one thing if it's that money is coming out of high income people's wallets. It's another thing when you've got people who are precariously housed in difficult situations. That money that you're taking out of their pocket is the money that they're using to go buy groceries or go buy clothes for their kids. So what ends up happening is you get people displaced from their homes. You get more people using food banks. We've seen across Canada, but particularly in the GTA, exceptionally long food bank lines. So we can never remember or never forget that humans are at the end of this. And when we're using monetary policy to take money out of their pockets, it forces people to make some very difficult decisions.
I want to go back to that chart that I showed earlier just to compare how Canada is doing in comparison to other countries. Jim, Italy and Germany have the lowest 2021 household debt in the G7. What makes them so different from Canada?
Well, the housing market situation is very different in those two countries than in Canada. So Mike pointed out from the beginning, housing is the big story here. In Germany and Italy, a couple of things. Number one, there's a lot more people who rent in those countries than in Canada, and they've got, in a way, more protection for renters. A common practice in Germany is you would rent a house or an apartment, and you would live there basically for your whole adult life. You've got rights as a renter. You can't be kicked out, and there's limits on how much the landlord can raise your rent. So in that type of situation that's more renter friendly, you don't have the same compulsion that you must buy your own home, as I think most Canadians feel, at least those who can afford it. Another factor would be, I think, that there's tighter controls on access to credit in terms of creditworthiness standards and some of the regulations regarding household lending and mortgage lending in particular. So in Canada, we've got a very liberalized banking system. And when interest rates were low, as they were through most of the period covered by this graph, first of all, credit looks cheap and in the short term for households. Secondly, banks have got an enormous incentive to basically load up customers with as much debt as the rules allow. And our rules, even though we do have stress tests and so on, the banks are supposed to look at households' ability to repay debt even at higher interest rates. In practice, honestly, there's been very little limit on how much banks can pump into household debt. And that has, in fact, fueled the housing bubble. The housing bubble could not have grown so much in Canada without this constant inflow of cheap credit. It's been very different in some of those other countries, which is why both housing prices are not as outrageous as they are in Canada, and household debt, as a result, is much more moderate.
We've been talking about this bubble, I think, for almost 2 decades now in Canada. The US and the UK have almost as high household debt as Canada, but at least theirs is going down instead of up. Canada's household debt, I think we've been talking about it for over 10 years. Mike, why is this problem so persistent in this country?
Well, I think it's again it all mostly goes back to housing. That our population is growing and our housing stock isn't. And one of the ways I think we can think of household debt is being a function of a lack of options. So in the housing market, what that means is there's not that many houses to buy, not that many houses to rent. So that forces people into these difficult situations where they're having to buy very expensive homes and go into a lot of debt. But we can also think a lack of options when it comes to things like transit. That we look at Italy and Germany, one thing that they have is very good transit, not just within cities, but between cities. So what that means is you don't necessarily have to buy a car or a second car. So you don't have to go into debt that way. So by giving people more options, it allows them to not necessarily take on debt if they don't have to. And unfortunately, in Canada, we've created this situation where there's not a lot of housing options, there's not a lot of transit options, kind of forcing people into cars and so on. So families have no choice but to take on large amounts of debt, even if they're not comfortable with it.
Jim, is it inevitable that Canadians are kind of being forced to go into household debt?
Oh, it's not inevitable at all. It clearly reflects structural forces and policy choices that we have made about how we're going to organize our housing system. We have relied very much on private home ownership as the dominant form of living arrangements in Canada. We've also, as Mike was just noting, relied on kind of extensive development of suburbs and single-family homes rather than more intensive urban developments, which are also common obviously in places like Germany and Italy. And we have really in Canada, I think a big part of the problem, stepped back from the provision of any other kind of housing arrangements. So what I might call non-market housing, if you like, where you're not just not buying the house yourself and you're not renting it from a landlord who's treating the house as an investment asset. In both cases, the value of having a roof over your head gets all mixed up with the idea that this is your most important financial asset. And that financialization, if you like, of housing is part of the problem. And we used to do things like housing co-ops, for example, or community housing trusts, or social housing, nonprofit housing of different kinds that break that link between the roof over your head and some kind of financial bet that people have to place on the value of their home, and hoping that their home will be their retirement plan in essence. And as Mike said, it is really, really wrong to think that you're going to fund your whole retirement with one asset. Okay, that just it's way too risky. So I think that part of the long run solution is going to be, as Mike says, to provide more choices to people, including the ability to just pay for a roof over your head at a fair rate, a secure rate, a sustainable rate where you've got rights as a tenant, but it doesn't require you to place this huge financial bet. And the banks won't like that because the banks make a fortune from the mortgage lending business that they run. But I think it's got to be an important part of solving this for Canadians in the long run.
Mike, you described the options that we have towards transit and housing as a function of a lack of options. When we talk about solutions, a solution that's been mentioned many, many times over the years is for Canada to build more housing. I don't want to yell this question, but I feel like I should yell this question. Why is Canada so bad at building homes?
Oh, it's any number of reasons. So first of it is municipal zoning and approvals process or things like that. We have set up a system that prevents anything from anything other than McMansions being built to high rises. So, for example, in most cities, I could take a small wartime bungalow, tear it down, and build a McMansion, and nobody could stop me. But if I wanted to build an affordable 3 or 4 unit triplex or quadplex, I can't do that without going through a lot of zoning and approvals process. So the whole system is designed to actually limit housing choices. Some of it is tax policy. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, we had very generous tax incentives in place to build purpose-built rentals. those have gone away. I think we need to look at those again. And Jim's right that whether it be social housing, co-op housing, all of these non-market options, they've been essentially taken off the table the last 35 to 40 years. We do have a national housing strategy designed to bring some of those back. It's spent a lot of money, hasn't really accomplished much yet. But it's got the sort of right idea that the government does need to play a bigger role in the housing market.
Ontario has pledged to build 1.5 million homes in the next decade. And now with the interest rates going up, I wanted to get a sense of both of you. Who is this economy working for? Jim?
Well, in that model, as announced by the Ford government in Ontario, it's working for housing development companies. First of all, they're drooling about all this former greenbelt land that they can build new monster home suburbs, and the profit motive driving the development industry leads them to those types of products because they're much more profitable than building affordable multi-unit homes in urban areas. Secondly, it obviously works for the banks. So again, the profits on the mortgage lending end of the business, as long as they avoid a housing meltdown. One of the interesting points of the graph you showed, Nam, was the decline in the debt ratio in the United States. And, you could look at that and say, well, the debt ratio has gone down since 2010. They've had a great run. But it was an ugly story behind it, which was called the housing meltdown that followed the mortgage lending crisis in that time. So as long as that doesn't happen in Canada, the banks are going to be laughing. And so, again, I think the profit motive has distorted the sort of choices that we make, both in what type of housing we build and how we provide it, and then how we pay for it. And this kind of, chicken and egg thing that's happening. People can't afford a house, so they go into debt. The purchasing power that comes from that debt helps the price go even higher on the housing, and so on and so forth. That relationship is really what's driven the escalating debt ratios in Canada.
And Mike?
So I'm going to say it's basically working for no one. I mean, one of the glib answers would be that, well, it's working for existing homeowners. That you have somebody who bought a house in Toronto in, I don't know, like 1975 for like $50,000, and now it's worth $2 or $3 million. But I'd even suggest it's not working particularly well for them. In one group, interestingly enough, that I talked to, who's most upset about the housing situation, is women in their 60s and 70s. Even though they might have bought a house 30 or 40 years ago and done well financially, what it's done is it's caused their kids to have to move out of the GTA and move to places like a Brantford or a Woodstock or so on. And then grandma doesn't get to see the grandkids anymore. So any kind of financial benefit on that side has been replaced with all of these social harms that it's, causing families to move farther apart from each other and things like that. So I suggest that this is working well for nobody, and we really need to reform this system sooner rather than later.
Jim, I'll give you the last minute. What do you say to Canadians who are struggling to make those mortgage payments, the rent payments, the credit card payments?
Well, for their individual perspective, all they can do is try and make ends meet. And Canadians are good at trying to scrounge and cut back on other things and do what they can to pay the necessary bills. So at an individual level, it's hard to know what else to do. At a collective level, we need to rethink how we think of a house. Is it a speculative financial asset, or is it a roof over our heads? And rethink how government has a central role to play in managing a housing system so that people can actually afford a decent home, not to get rich on, but to live a good life in.
Jim, Mike, thank you so much for having this discussion. I know a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet, and this helps us understand the situation a little bit better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nam.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.